having an opportunity to view the Mulford coat, and it asks a lot of questions. It offers a lot of tantalizing details in terms of its construction. Um, I understand the story is that the family history has the coat going back to the Revolutionary War period. Yet, we see before us a coat that has many attributes that are consistent with a history after the war, but some additional clues that suggest that the family story has a ring of truth to it. Um, the frock coat, and it is a frock coat because it's got a collar. The body shape is very consistent with a man's frock coat of high fashion from the 1770s up to around early 1780s. By the time you get into the 1780s, this curvature, instead of being a fairly even curve, would be fairly steep up at the breast till about this point, and then would sweep sharply back. So that's something in favor of the earlier attribution. Um, if we were to look at this, and I would love to have an opportunity at some point to make a pattern off of this, which would allow us to study what's known as the grain line, the warp and the weft of the fabric, how the cloth is constructed. This is a scarlet superfine broadcloth, a fairly high quality product, a fairly expensive product in its day that could only have been afforded by those who were fairly wealthy. And it was a very high quality broadcloth that also had a nap. It had a finished surface that was combed, had a combed finish, so it has a very velvety feel. And that velvety texture has a direction to it which runs down this way. Again, this is something very consistent with a high-end product of quality. It also meant this garment was going to be a store of value, in that this would have cost, I mean, this essentially was the value of the cloth in this coat was a working man's wages for a year of a common laborer. Obviously, Mr. Mulford was well above that stature, and so he had the means to be able to afford a fine scarlet cloth such as this. Some have said that his loyalist tendencies would lead one, or that it would bespeak one who was a loyalist to wear a scarlet coat. Not necessarily. Scarlet was a very popular color. There is an account of a doctor in Watertown, Massachusetts on the morning of April 19, 1775, wearing a full suit of scarlet, and he was turning out with his militia company to march against the British regulars. So they discreetly suggested he might not want to wear that pretty suit on that particular day, because bad things could happen to him by mistake. But the coat is also lined with a product known as shalloon, which is a glazed, twill-woven worsted wool material, glazed by hot pressing under hot metal plates to give it a luster and to give it a slipability, yet have some fashionable warmth. And so in some respects, you could have lined this in twill silk, which would have worn out faster. The twill wool with the glazing made it slip well over wool outer clothing or underclothing, and or silk alike. And so again, it's a practical, pragmatic approach to clothing that you find in this period in America. That a wool coat would typically have a wool lining. As we get later on into the period, more and more you find in the 1780s and 90s very frequently wool coats, while many of them still had a wool lining, more and more went over to a twill silk lining. So, and by the first quarter of the 19th century, a twill silk lining in a man's high-end coat was very common and would have been more the norm. So again, it's another feature that helps to favor the family story about it's being worn during the American Revolution period. A few other features that we want to look at today. again, the features for and against the earlier usage. Um, we see a number of alterations in this garment. To look at it at its surface, the characteristics we immediately see are this standing and falling collar with a collar rise and a collar fall. This is very indicative of a man's coat from the 1780s and 90s. Um, by the early 19th century, by the early 1800s, this would resolve itself in just a solid standing collar with a very high collar. But in the 1780s, the collar height is gradually rising up so that by 1790 you might have something that looks like this. However, if we look at the anatomy of this collar, we can see that the collar rise is composed of several pieces, which is and the collar fall is composed of several pieces, which is very uncharacteristic. Normally, the fashion side of such a garment would have been composed of two pieces of wool, one on either side of a center back seam, and it just was the way things were done. Furthermore, if we turn the collar over, we can see multiple pieces of fairly new looking wool of a quality and a texture that is not quite the same as the wool of the coat. So it could be that additional fabric was introduced to build up this higher collar, yet, and we have this piece of wool patched in at the back, very crudely done, to fill a gap in the back. Does this suggest that perhaps cloth was removed from underneath the original falling collar to use as a means of altering the coat somewhere else? That's a possibility that further research could help reveal.
Or any repairs also? Or if any, maybe they could use it to put it over a hole or
It could have been used to repair a hole. It could have been used to do further alterations, and I'll point out some other alterations elsewhere in the garment. A third feature we see when looking at the underside of the collar is the fact that where the collar rises up, the wool is the front and back panels of the wool are butted close together, whereas the falling part of the collar, the under part is cut back. If we look closely at the stitching appears to have been done by two different sets of hands in a slightly different manner. And we can also see that in a few other parts of the coat, which I'll show you in just a moment. But this tends to suggest that at some point in this coat's history, the coat may not have been originally made in the 1780s, but may have been made earlier and then altered to its present shape at a later date in the 1790s. Some other features. The buttons. These beautiful large buttons, which if I take out my trusty tape measure, we see that the buttons measure 1.25 inches in diameter. That's a very large button for the 1770s. We notice the buttons on the cuff are also extremely large. Cuff buttons on a coat of this sort in the 1770s typically would have been much smaller, more like 3/4 inch. It suggests to me, again, that it's one of the things that would stand in favor of an attribution of the 1780s, 90s period for this coat, except if one looks at the buttonholes on the front of the coat opposite each button, we can see those buttonholes are fairly small and would suggest that the buttons that may have been on here originally might also have been smaller. Further study would be needed to see if there is additional picking, that the lining might have been drawn back to facilitate putting the larger buttons on at a later date. That's something that would require additional research, something I would love to do. Same with the cuff. So again, we have some more tantalizing features. Looking further down the coat, we peel back the, excuse me, don't peel back the coat. Looking at the buttons, if we look, a typical feature of these coats was buttons in the tail pleats. And again, there is another one of these large buttons set in the tail pleats, but there is evidence further up here that parts of the coat tail skirt were pieced in. There's a spot here where there is an added piece that was added on to lengthen the back, the skirt at the side and raise its height up. You can actually see it quite well here. You can see where a piece of cloth was added in, suggesting that this coat may have had a longer waist to it that extended maybe 1.5 to almost 2 inches lower than the current button placement is today. To confirm this, certainly if we patterned out this garment, I think we would find evidence that there is a lozenge of fabric added in here to raise the height of both the front and back skirt pleat panels to make this waistline higher, which again suggests that this coat started out with a lower waistline. Buttressing that is the fact that immediately adjacent to where we have the piecing, we have this very nice rectangular pocket flap, very nicely constructed, interfaced with a pocket underneath. However, if we look closely, we see that about 2 inches below the current pocket, there is the stitched in outline of a previous pocket, a much lower pocket. Lower waistlines were fairly typical in the 1770s. Coats typically had a low waist construction that would essentially parallel not the natural waist of the body, but approximately the top of the hip line. This would be consistent with what we see here. As the fashion trends change in the 1780s and 90s, the men's waistline on fashionable coats rises by 1 inch to 2 inches. The pocket line rises here 1 inch to 2 inches. It appears that there's a piecing that raises up the hip line on this coat 1.5 inches to 2 inches. So we're starting to build a case for the possibility that this garment may have been altered. The third item of evidence is when we look at these sleeves. The sleeves have got a very close fit, which was typical of the last half of the 18th century, especially the last quarter of the 18th century, into the early 19th century. By the time you get into the period around 1812 to 1815, this tight-fitting sleeve, if you look, you see a very narrow silhouette going from the shoulder over the bicep with a very sharp curve at the elbow and into a very narrow cuff. We have a lot going on in this cuff area. We have these very large buttons. We have a slit cut into the body of the sleeve. We have a cuff extension, a 1-inch cuff extension that is sewed to the bottom of the original sleeve with newer wool added on. We also see shadow lines, but we also, where a cuff may have set earlier at the back of the cuff, we can see fading and soiling. And then we have this rather diminutive cuff at the very bottom, turned up with a buttonhole. If we compare these 3 buttonholes with the 3 buttonholes on the front of the coat, again we see the suggestion that they may have been done either at a different time or by a different set of hands with slightly different skill sets than the person who actually constructed the coat. If we look closely at the grain lines, we see that when this slit was put in, it was a piece of fabric was added underneath to carry the buttons, that it drew this cuff in, the sleeve in, even narrower, made it very tight. but also extended the bottom of the cuff from just below the wrist bone to beginning to come down over the palm of the hand, just to about the break of the thumb joint, where it joins on. Again, this is consistent with what we find in men's coats being made in the 1780s and 90s, uh, and that this is an alteration of a coat that would have originally broke just below the wrist bone. Again, suggesting that this was an earlier period of construction that was altered to this current mode. This is further supported by the fact that if we look closely on both sleeves, we see just above the joint line where this piecing is added, we see about an inch long line here and an inch long line here of stitching where a slit was closed up, representing a buttonhole. Again, suggesting a slightly wider sleeve with a slit opening up the back. And I'm not going to tease this out to see, but if we look a little further up, we also see a place where there was a bar tack about another inch higher. Very consistent with what we see on a slit back to a sleeve closure during the Revolutionary War period. This was very common, very fashionable. By way of comparison, here in the island, the Thomas Weeks Queens County Troop of Horse coatee that's at Oyster Bay has exactly the same button hole arrangement along a back slit with a bar tack a little higher up, with a cuff that would extend now below that point by about 2 or 3 inches. Suggesting again that this original cuff, which currently folds up inside the sleeve by a good inch and a half to join on. I'm sure if we studied this a little further, we would find that the original cuff was a little bit deeper and extended a little higher up, consistent with these buttonholes, and that this, if we explore underneath where the stitching is on the inside of the coat, that we would find evidence of where a cuff flap may have been added back here that got moved in over here into this area. This slit in the middle of the sleeve was very fashionable in the 1790s, whereas during the Revolutionary War period, the slit at the back seam was very, very common, especially in military or military-oriented coats. The Weeks coatee, the Peter Gansevoort coat, another New York coat at the Smithsonian, all have this particular feature. And in the case of the Gansevoort and the Weeks coatee, they have small buttons ranging up from the cuff up onto the sleeve to close that slit. Again, another piece of evidence suggesting that this coat, along with its fairly close fit, was something originally made perhaps in the mid to late 1770s. Which, from what I've been told, is consistent with Mr. Mulford's time in service, and that at some later date, probably during the 1780s or early 1790s, that alterations were made to this coat to make it more fashionable. The cloth, because of what it was a store of value, and so you wouldn't throw something like this out, but would modify it to the more current fashion. Apparently it suited Mr. Mulford just fine. To our eye, some of the additions look somewhat crude, but I'm sure in the eyes of his peers, they liked it just well enough. To me, these are all cases that beg further research to find out, help us learn more about the history of this remarkable survivor of the 18th century. And it would be a fascinating study to take and make a pattern off of this garment, and then take the evidence we have and reproduce this coat for display alongside the artifact coat, to show what it would have looked like during the Revolutionary era. I think, and I would love to have an opportunity to do just that. But that said, it is still a fascinating garment, a treasure that the East Hampton Historical Society should be proud and honored to have, and find opportunities for its proper conservation and display. I think that's about it.
Great.
How would they have ever have cleaned this or attempted to clean it with the ash?
Good question. The question of how this was cleaned. I suspect Mr. Mulford wore this on special occasions. There is some evidence. One of the problems of this, the dyes used for this, is one of the good things is the dyes that were used were a dye drug known as cochineal, made from ground up bugs, scale bugs that live on cactus. But the color, the bright scarlet, was fixed in with tin salts. The good news of that is that the tin salts inhibit insect infestation. We find many of the original coats, the Weeks coatee, for example, and others like this in collections across the country, suffer very little in the way of insect damage, except in places like right along the front, right here at the elbow, right here at the roll line of the collar, where you get protein staining and soiling and oils from human beings or other forms of dirt getting on the coat that provide food for an insect pest. The downside of it is these colors, the dye stuffs have a tendency to degrade and acquire, in many cases, something of a slight sooty cast. It's actually a purplish cast if you look at it real closely. And again, that is the nature of the oxidation of the dye drug itself and the little creatures that created it. In terms of its cleaning, most commonly this garment would have been brushed regularly by the servants of the household to remove food particles and to get off surface soiling. I, again, would need further study to determine if it was ever wet washed in any way. If it was, the other mode of removing stains was to rub in fuller's earth, which is a type of clay that you would mix into a water slurry, rub it into the cloth with a damp washing cloth, and then it has the capacity to draw out oil, and it would lift out oily stains or oily soils. After its last round of wearing, I don't think it saw a lot of cleaning, because we see a lot of collar soiling at the roll line of the 1790s incarnation of the collar, where it would have been rubbing up against the back of the neck and up against the base of a queue or pigtail that would have been oiled and powdered in full dress wear, and that you can see has been transferred onto the coat collar back here. Beyond that, you could very carefully wet wash this. That today would be the provenance, given what it is, would be the provenance of a professional textile conservator who has the tools and the large wash tables to enable it to be very carefully and slowly washed, and just as carefully and slowly dried. Because of the nature of the way this garment was constructed, gummed linen called buckram was laid in along the front edge on both sides of the coat, from the neck edge all the way down to the bottom hem. You can still feel that in place in between the lining and the shell. And then on the button side, additional double layer was added in to withstand the strain of the buttons that are actually poked through. The button shanks are poked through with a piece of linen tape run through the eyelets on the underside and then covered over by the lining. This coat was made with a very sharp sweep back that required it to be fastened at the breast with hooks and eyes. Again, very consistent with something that might have been worn as a military garment at some point. No, the East Hampton Historical Society has in its collection this remarkable treasure, this remarkable survivor of a pastime of our what I believe could be a coat from our Revolutionary era here on the island, and with additional study, I think more of its secrets could be revealed, and I think it would be a fascinating study to take a pattern and do a detailed study of the coat's construction and the alterations that have taken place, perhaps piece back together what this coat would have looked like in its original construction, and then, for the sake of education, to recreate the coat as it would have appeared historically when it was first constructed, and have it on display on special occasions alongside the existing artifact. This coat is very much in both in its the rareness of its survival and its association with people associated with the history and the Revolutionary era. It is truly a national treasure, and I think one that the East Hampton Historical Society should be proud to own and take the best care of this treasure and find ways to bring its history out to the public more fully. And I hope that I might have an opportunity to talk further with the Historical Society and share some additional thoughts and suggestions and ideas as to how we might go about that. But it is truly a treasure, and it has been truly a privilege to be here today to share with you some of my observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cut.